If you clicked on this video, you're probably experiencing something deeply unsettling. Memories appearing in your mind that don't match your actual history. Remembering conversations that never occurred. Feeling certain about events that others swear never happened. Experiencing déjà vu so intense it feels like you've lived entire scenarios before. And everyone around you, friends, family, therapists, is telling you it's false memory, confabulation, your mind playing tricks. But what if they're wrong? What if you're not losing your grip on reality? What if you're actually gaining access to quantum reality that exists beyond the single timeline your culture taught you to believe is the only reality? There's a quantum phenomenon so radical that mainstream science barely acknowledges it, even though mathematics proves it exists. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics shows that every quantum event creates branching timelines where all possible outcomes occur simultaneously. You don't just exist in one timeline. You exist in infinite timelines, each one slightly different from the others. And normally consciousness is locked into perceiving a single timeline, unaware of all the parallel versions playing out simultaneously. But something is shifting. Your consciousness is beginning to bleed between timelines. And those false memories aren't false at all. They're real memories from parallel timelines that your expanding awareness is now accessing. Can you feel that? That strange relief mixed with vertigo as you read those words. That's consciousness recognizing truth that cultural conditioning said was impossible. You're not crazy. You're not experiencing psychological dysfunction. You're experiencing quantum awakening. Your awareness is expanding beyond single timeline perception into multi-timeline consciousness. And those memories that never happened in this timeline absolutely happened in parallel timelines that quantum you experienced. Quantum physics has proven that particles exist in superposition until observed simultaneously in multiple states, multiple locations, multiple configurations. But here's what most people don't grasp. Consciousness works the same way. You're not just in one reality, making one set of choices, experiencing one outcome. At quantum level, every choice you could make, you do make. Every path you could take, you do take. Every version of your life that's possible exists simultaneously in parallel timelines. The you reading these words is just one version out of infinite versions. All existing right now. All making different choices. All experiencing different outcomes. Normally, you're completely unconscious of parallel timelines. Brain filters perception to show you only the single timeline. It's currently focused on creating illusion that this is the only reality. This filtering is survival mechanism. If you were constantly aware of infinite timelines, you couldn't function in single timeline with coherent sense of identity and purpose. But the filtering also limits you, keeps you trapped in single probability stream when infinite probability streams exist, prevents you from accessing information, abilities, and outcomes that parallel versions of you are experiencing. But now something is changing. The membrane between timelines is thinning. Consciousness is beginning to perceive across timelines rather than being locked into single timeline. And that multi-timeline perception is what you're experiencing as false memories. You remember the conversation because you did have it in parallel timeline where different choices led to that conversation occurring. You remember the event because it did happen in parallel timeline where circumstances aligned differently. You remember the relationship, the career, the experience that never happened in this timeline because they absolutely did happen in timelines you're now becoming aware of. Ancient mystics knew about this. The Akashic records that spiritual traditions speak of aren't mystical library in the sky. Their quantum field where all timelines exist simultaneously, where consciousness can access information from any timeline. if awareness expands enough to perceive beyond single timeline limitation. The prophecies, the visions, the knowing about things that haven't happened yet. All of it is consciousness accessing parallel timelines where those events already occurred or are occurring differently. Take a breath. Deep one, because what comes next will either make everything click into place or trigger more confusion. You're about to understand why memories of things that never happened are appearing now. Why your consciousness is bleeding between timelines. Why quantum reality is becoming visible when it was hidden before. And what this means for your ability to consciously navigate between timelines rather than being unconsciously trapped in whichever timeline you happen to be perceiving when awareness began expanding. Before we go deeper into what's actually happening when you remember things that never occurred in this timeline, you need to understand what timelines actually are and how consciousness navigates between them. Because most people think of timelines as completely separate realities, like parallel universes in science fiction, that have no connection to each other. But that's not how quantum timelines work. They're not separate. They're interpenetrating. They exist simultaneously in same quantum space, differentiated only by frequency. And consciousness can shift between them not by traveling through space, but by shifting frequency. Think of timelines like radio stations. All the stations exist simultaneously, broadcasting different content on different frequencies. Your radio doesn't receive all stations at once. It's tuned to specific frequency. So you hear only that station, while remaining completely unaware of all other stations broadcasting at the same time. But change the frequency, and suddenly you're receiving different station, different content, different reality. The previous station didn't disappear. It's still broadcasting. You just shifted your receiver to different frequency. Consciousness works exactly the same way. You're not in one timeline. You're tuned to one timeline. Your awareness is set to specific frequency that allows you to perceive this particular probability stream out of infinite probability streams existing simultaneously. And normally, that frequency remains stable. You stay tuned to same timeline your entire life, experiencing linear progression through single reality, completely unaware that parallel versions of you are experiencing completely different realities on different frequencies. But frequency can shift. And when it does, even slightly, you begin perceiving information from timelines you weren't tuned to before. You might not fully shift into different timeline. That would be complete reality change, where your entire history rewrites. But you can partially overlap with parallel timeline, where your consciousness is receiving information from both timelines simultaneously. And that overlap is what creates the false memory experience. You're remembering something that happened in timeline you're partially overlapping with, but didn't happen in timeline you're primarily tuned to. The confusion comes because brain tries to make sense of conflicting information. You have memory of conversation, but physical evidence shows conversation never occurred. You remember relationship existing, but records show you were single during that period. You recall event happening, but everyone else remembers it differently or not at all. Brain can't reconcile the conflict, so it defaults to what seems most logical. The memory must be false, must be imagination, must be error. But the memory isn't false. The memory is real information from parallel timeline that consciousness is now partially accessing. This timeline overlap typically happens during 3 specific conditions. First, during major life transitions when you're naturally in quantum flux. Death of someone close, end of relationship, career change, relocation, health crisis. These transitions create instability in consciousness that temporarily loosens your frequency lock on current timeline. The instability allows brief overlap with parallel timelines where you made different choices or experience different outcomes during similar transitions. Second, during altered states, deep meditation, psychedelic journeys, near-death experiences, intense dreams, moments of profound insight. These states temporarily shift consciousness to frequencies where timeline barriers dissolve. You perceive across timelines rather than within single timeline. Information from parallel realities becomes accessible. And sometimes that information integrates into your memory, as if it happened in this timeline, creating confusion when you return to normal state and realize the memory doesn't match this timeline's history. Third, during quantum shifts in collective field. Right now, in this period of human history, the entire species is experiencing frequency shift. Old paradigms collapsing, new consciousness emerging, reality itself becoming more fluid. This collective shift affects individual consciousness. Everyone is experiencing some degree of timeline overlap. Though most dismiss it or don't recognize what's happening, the veil between timelines is thinning globally. And that thinning manifests as increasing numbers of people remembering things that never happened in the timeline they're currently perceiving. Understanding this framework immediately shifts your relationship with false memories. They're not symptoms of dysfunction. They're evidence of expanding awareness. They're not things to dismiss or feel crazy about. They're quantum information from parallel timelines that consciousness is now capable of accessing. The question isn't why is my mind creating false memories? The question is why is my consciousness now perceiving across timelines, and what does that expanding perception allow? There are specific types of memories that never happened that confirm you're experiencing timeline overlap rather than psychological dysfunction. These patterns distinguish between actual false memory creation, which does happen, and genuine perception of parallel timeline information. And recognizing these patterns helps you understand which memories are quantum information versus which are mind-filling gaps with imagination. The first pattern is memory with impossible detail. False memories tend to be vague, filled with gaps, missing sensory information. But timeline memories are complete. You remember exact conversation, specific words spoken, precise emotions felt, detailed sensory experience, sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, all present in memory. You remember things you couldn't possibly know if memory were fabricated, like what person was wearing, what room looked like, what weather was doing. The richness of detail suggests consciousness actually experienced this in parallel timeline, rather than imagination constructing memory from fragments. The second pattern is memory that contradicts your character or choices in this timeline. You remember making decision that completely contradicts your values, your patterns, your typical behavior. You remember choosing path you would never choose in this timeline. This is strong indicator of parallel timeline memory, because if mind were creating false memory, it would create memory consistent with your identity, not contradictory to it. The fact that memory shows you acting completely differently suggests consciousness is accessing timeline where you made different choice became different version. The third pattern is memory that others partially confirm with different details. You remember event happening one way. Others remember similar event but with significant differences, different location, different timing, different people present, different outcome. This suggests both you and they are experiencing timeline overlap, but you're accessing different parallel timelines where event occurred differently. If memory were completely false, others wouldn't remember anything. But partial overlap with conflicting details indicates multiple timeline bleeding occurring simultaneously. The fourth pattern is memory with emotional residue that doesn't match this timeline's history. You feel grief about loss that never occurred. You feel resentment about betrayal that never happened. You feel nostalgia for relationship that never existed. These emotions are real. You feel them in your body, in your energy, but they have no origin point in this timeline's events. This emotional residue often comes from parallel timeline where you did experience the loss, the betrayal, the relationship. The emotion crossed timelines, even though the event didn't. The fifth pattern is memory that suddenly appears fully formed. False memories typically build gradually as mind pieces together fragments. But timeline memories appear complete and sudden. One moment you have no memory of event. Next moment you have full detailed memory, as if you always remembered it. This sudden appearance suggests consciousness just accessed parallel timeline, where memory exists downloading entire experience instantaneously rather than constructing it gradually. The sixth pattern is multiple people independently remembering same event that never happened. You and stranger both remember major event occurring. Celebrity death, geographic change, product name being different, but records show your shared memory is false. This is Mandela effect, named after widespread memory of Nelson Mandela, dying in prison when officially he died decades later. These shared false memories are too consistent across people who have never communicated to be coincidental false memory creation. More likely consciousness is collectively accessing parallel timeline where event did occur differently, and that timeline is bleeding into this one. The seventh pattern is memory that includes you having different identity, different relationships, different circumstances while still being recognizably you. You remember being married to different person, or having different career, or living in different location, but it's clearly you in memory, not someone else. This suggests consciousness accessing timeline, where you made different major life choices, creating divergent life path. These memories can be particularly disorienting because they show you living life that feels simultaneously familiar. It's you and completely foreign. You never made those choices here. Write in comments which patterns you're experiencing. Just list them. Impossible detail or contradicts character or emotional residue. That acknowledgement does something important. It helps you distinguish between genuine timeline overlap and actual false memory. It validates your experience as quantum phenomenon rather than dismissing it as dysfunction. And it connects you with others experiencing same patterns, confirming this is collective shift in consciousness, not individual pathology. Now that you understand what timeline overlap is and how to recognize it, the question becomes, why is this happening to you now? Why is your consciousness suddenly bleeding between timelines when it never did before? Because timeline overlap isn't random. It doesn't happen to everyone equally. It happens to specific people at specific developmental stages for specific quantum reasons. And understanding why it's happening reveals what you're being prepared for. The first reason is consciousness evolution. Your awareness is expanding beyond three-dimensional linear perception into quantum multidimensional perception. This expansion is natural progression for consciousness, like child developing, from seeing only colors to recognizing shapes to understanding depth perception. You're developing quantum perception, which includes ability to perceive across timelines rather than being locked into single timeline. The false memories are early stage of this development, like blurry images, when learning to focus eyes. Eventually, with practice, you'll learn to consciously navigate timeline perception rather than experiencing it as confusing memory overlap. The second reason is soul integration. Esoteric traditions teach that soul exists across multiple timelines, simultaneously experiencing different versions of same lifetime to learn different lessons. Usually, these parallel experiences remain completely separate in consciousness. But at certain stages of development, soul begins integrating experiences across timelines, bringing wisdom and understanding from parallel lives into conscious awareness. The memories that never happened are sometimes souls showing you lessons learned or paths explored in parallel timelines. Integrating that information to accelerate your evolution in this timeline. The third reason is preparation for timeline shifting. Some people are developing ability to consciously shift between timelines rather than remaining locked in whichever timeline they were born into. This is advanced quantum skill that requires first becoming aware that multiple timelines exist, then learning to perceive them, then eventually learning to shift your consciousnesses, tuning to different timeline frequency. The memory overlap is training wheels. You're being shown that parallel realities exist, that you exist in multiple versions, that consciousness can access information across timelines. This awareness is prerequisite for eventual timeline navigation. The fourth reason is quantum correction. Sometimes consciousness shifts slightly between timelines without you consciously choosing it. And the shift happens because current timeline was leading toward outcome that doesn't serve your highest evolution. The shift might be tiny, one different choice in one moment. But that choice creates branching point where two timelines diverge. You might experience memory of what was going to happen in previous timeline, even though you're now in slightly different timeline, where that outcome won't occur. This creates confusion because you remember future that's no longer going to manifest in timeline you're currently experiencing. The fifth reason is collective reality malleability. During periods of major collective transformation, which humanity is experiencing now, reality becomes more fluid. The consensus timeline becomes less stable. Multiple possible futures exist in stronger superposition than usual. And this collective quantum flux affects individual experience of timeline stability. More people are experiencing timeline overlap because collective field is less rigid about maintaining single coherent timeline. The membrane between possible realities is thinning, and consciousness is naturally perceiving across that membrane. The sixth reason is awakening to manifestation power. When you recognize that multiple timelines exist, that parallel versions of you are living different outcomes based on different choices, you begin understanding that reality isn't fixed. You're not trapped in single predetermined future. Every moment offers quantum choice point where you can shift which timeline you're aligning with through your choices, your focus, your frequency. The memory overlap shows you viscerally that other possibilities exist, other outcomes are real, other versions of your life are actually occurring. This recognition unlocks your ability to consciously choose which timeline probability you want to align with rather than unconsciously following whichever timeline you happen to be locked into. The seventh reason is DNA activation. Quantum biologists are discovering that DNA responds to consciousness and contains far more information than genetic coding for physical body. Some researchers suggest DNA acts as quantum antenna that can receive information from parallel timelines. As consciousness evolves, as frequency shifts, dormant aspects of DNA activate, and part of that activation includes increased capacity to receive cross-timeline information. Your false memories might be DNA beginning to function as it was designed to function, accessing quantum information that was always there, but previously inaccessible. 8 years ago, I had memory appear fully formed that made no sense. I remembered having twin sister who died in childhood. The memory was complete. Her name, her appearance, specific moments we shared, the devastating grief of losing her. But I'm an only child. Always have been. No sister, twin or otherwise. Medical records confirm no twin. Family confirms no sister. Yet the memory was so real, so detailed, so emotionally charged that I couldn't dismiss it as imagination. At first, I did what you're probably doing now. Questioned my sanity, researched false memory syndrome, wondered if I was experiencing some psychological break, tried to convince myself the memory wasn't real, but it wouldn't go away, and the emotional residue was too powerful to be fantasy. I grieved for sister, who never existed in this timeline. The grief was real, even though the loss wasn't. Then I discovered quantum timeline theory, and everything clicked. I understood the memory was real. In parallel timeline, I did have twin sister. She did die. I did experience that loss. And for some reason, my consciousness had accessed that parallel timeline's memory. Maybe because in that timeline, I learned something through that experience that I needed to know in this timeline. Maybe because the grief I carried there was affecting my frequency here and needed acknowledgement to release. Maybe because consciousness was showing me that other versions of my life exist, that I'm not limited to single timeline experience. After that initial overlap, more memories appeared. I remembered career path I never pursued, but felt completely familiar with years of experience, specific skills, relationships with colleagues, success and challenges in that field. I remembered living in country I've never visited but knowing streets, culture, daily rhythms intimately. I remembered version of myself who made completely different choices at key life junctures, creating dramatically different life trajectory. These memories weren't vague fantasies. They were detailed, consistent, emotionally real. The breakthrough came when I stopped fighting the memories and started treating them as quantum information, instead of trying to determine which memories were real versus false. I recognized they were all real, just from different timelines. Instead of feeling crazy, I felt expanded. I was accessing information my single timeline consciousness couldn't access before. I was learning from parallel versions of myself, gaining wisdom from paths I both did and didn't take, depending on which timeline you're referencing. And here's what's profound. The information from parallel timeline memories proved useful in this timeline. The career skills I remembered, but never learned here. I found I could actually perform them. The relationship wisdom I gained from parallel timeline, where I made different choices, helped me navigate relationships here more skillfully. The grief I carried from timeline, where I lost sister, deepened my capacity for compassion in this timeline. The memories weren't just interesting quantum phenomenon. They were integrated wisdom from parallel experiences, making me more whole. This is what I wish someone had told me when timeline overlap first began. Your consciousness isn't breaking, it's expanding. The memories that never happened aren't evidence of dysfunction. They're evidence that you're developing quantum perception. You're not losing grip on reality. You're gaining access to larger reality that exists beyond single timeline your culture convinced you was the only reality. Your experience might be different from mine. Your timeline memories might involve different people, different choices, different versions of your life. But the principle is same. You're perceiving across timelines. You're accessing information from parallel realities where different choices created different outcomes. And that perception is gift, not curse. It's evolution of consciousness, not deterioration of mind. Now that you understand timeline overlap is real and why it's happening, the question becomes practical. How do you work with this quantum phenomenon without losing functional coherence in this timeline? Because yes, you're perceiving across timelines. Yes, parallel memories of valid information. But you still need to function effectively in whichever timeline you're currently focused on. And that requires developing skill of holding multi-timeline awareness while maintaining primary focus on this timeline's continuity. The first practice is conscious labeling. When memory appears that doesn't match this timeline, consciously label it. Parallel timeline information. Don't dismiss it. Don't pathize it, but don't confuse it with this timeline's history either. Acknowledge it as real information from different probability stream. This labeling does two things. Validates the memory as legitimate quantum information while creating boundary that prevents confusion between timelines. You can hold both truths. The memory is real, and it didn't happen here. The second practice is tracking emotional residue. Sometimes parallel timeline memories carry emotions that affect this timeline's experience. You feel grief that has no source here. You feel resentment toward person who never betrayed you here. You feel fear about event that never occurred here. When you notice emotion without corresponding this timeline cause, ask, is this parallel timeline emotion? If yes, acknowledge it came from different timeline. Feel it fully as you would any emotion. Then consciously release it. The emotion was valid there, but it doesn't need to run your life here. The third practice is extracting wisdom without adopting history. Parallel timeline memories often contain lessons learned, skills developed, understanding gained through experiences you didn't have in this timeline. You can extract that wisdom, the insight, the knowing, the capability without needing to believe you literally lived that history here. Think of it as downloading information from parallel version of yourself. The information is useful. The history doesn't need to be grafted onto this timeline's narrative. The fourth practice is reality checking with curiosity rather than doubt. When memory appears, check it against this timeline's evidence. Not to invalidate the memory, but to determine which timeline it's from. If evidence confirms memory matches this timeline, integrate it as this timeline memory. If evidence shows memory doesn't match this timeline, recognize it as parallel timeline information. The checking isn't to determine if you're crazy. The checking is quantum navigation, determining which timeline-specific information belongs to. The fifth practice is using parallel memories as manifestation guidance. If you remember version of yourself who made different choice and experienced positive outcome, that memory shows you possibility that exists in quantum field, that outcome is real in parallel timeline, which means it exists as probability you can align within this timeline through making choices that shift your frequency toward that probability. The memory isn't just information. It's showing you what's possible, what paths exist, what versions of your life are actually occurring in parallel realities. The sixth practice is maintaining present moment focus while allowing timeline fluidity. Don't become so fascinated with parallel timeline memories that you lose engagement with this timeline's present moment. The memories are enrichment, not escape. They expand your understanding of what's possible. But your power to create, to choose, to act exists in this timelines. Now, use parallel information to inform choices, but make those choices fully present in this timeline's current reality. The seventh practice is sharing selectively and without needing validation. Most people won't understand timeline overlap. They'll think you're confused, delusional, or attention-seeking. Share with those who can hold the complexity. People who understand quantum consciousness, who have experienced similar phenomena, who won't try to convince you the memories are false. And if no one in your life can hold this, that's okay. The experience is valid, whether others validate it or not. Your knowing doesn't require external confirmation. Something profound happens after you stabilize in multi-timeline awareness that most people aren't prepared for. The solid reality you thought you lived in reveals itself as fluid, malleable, constantly shifting. You start noticing small changes in your timeline that weren't there before. Details that you're certain were one way are suddenly different way, and everyone else remembers them the different way, as if they were always that way. This isn't memory getting worse. This is you becoming conscious of timeline shifts, as they occur rather than unconsciously adjusting to each shift and forgetting previous version. This is where timeline overlap moves from passive experience, receiving memories from parallel timelines, to active recognition, noticing when your consciousness shifts between timelines or when timeline itself shifts around you. Most people experience thousands of tiny timeline shifts throughout life, but never consciously notice because brain automatically adjusts memory to match current timeline. You think you've always been in same timeline experiencing linear progression, but actually you've been shifting between similar timelines your entire life, unconsciously jumping between parallel probability streams while brain creates illusion of continuity. But once you become aware of timeline overlap, once you know parallel realities exist, the automatic adjustment stops working as smoothly. You start catching the shifts. You remember detail being one way, you see it's now different way. And instead of brain automatically accepting new version, you hold both versions in awareness simultaneously. You notice timeline changed. You remember what was. You see what now is. And you recognize this is different. Something shifted. This conscious recognition of timeline shifts creates what researchers call the Mandela effect, named after widespread memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison in 1980s when official timeline shows he died in 2013. Thousands of people share specific detailed memories of his prison death, his funeral, his widow's remarks. Memories that don't match current timeline's history. This isn't mass false memory. This is evidence of timeline shift, where enough people remember previous version that when shift occurred, not everyone's memory automatically adjusted. Similar Mandela effects keep appearing. Movie quotes changing. Product names spelling differently. Geographic features in different locations. Historical events occurring in different years. Celebrities dying, and people remember them dying earlier. Small details of reality shifting, while most people remain completely unconscious that anything changed. But those who have developed multi-timeline awareness notice. We remember previous version. We see current version. We recognize the timeline shifted, and we're conscious enough now to catch it. These shifts aren't random. They occur at quantum choice points. Moments when collective or individual consciousness makes decision that creates branching point between timelines. Major collective events, personal life transitions, consciousness evolution leaps, all create timeline branching. Most branches are nearly identical to previous timeline, differing only in tiny details. Some branches diverge significantly, and your consciousness sometimes shifts to different branch than the one you were previously experiencing. Either because your choices created different trajectory, or because collective fields shifted and carried you into different collective timeline. The disorientation of noticing timeline shifts is profound. It's one thing to access memories from parallel timeline while knowing you're still in stable this timeline. It's completely different to realize this timeline itself isn't stable. That you're experiencing reality that's constantly shifting. That what was true yesterday might not be true today. Not because you're misremembering, but because timeline actually changed. This recognition can trigger existential crisis if you're not prepared. If there's no solid, unchanging reality, what is real? What can you trust? How do you maintain coherent sense of self when the world keeps shifting? But here's the profound realization that stabilizes consciousness once you move through the crisis. If reality is fluid, if timelines shift, if you can notice the shifts, you're not trapped in predetermined fate. Every moment offers possibility of timeline shift. Every choice you make influences which timeline you experience. You're not victim of circumstances in fixed reality. Your quantum navigator constantly choosing which probability stream to align with through your choices, your focus, your frequency. The fluidity that seemed terrifying becomes empowering once you understand you can participate consciously in determining which timeline you experience. What's happening to you individually as you develop multi-timeline awareness is happening to millions globally. This isn't isolated phenomenon. This is collective consciousness evolution, where species is beginning to perceive quantum nature of reality, rather than being trapped in illusion of single fixed timeline, where enough humans are simultaneously experiencing timeline overlap. Mandela affects reality fluidity, that the collective field itself is transforming from rigid consensus reality to fluid multi-timeline awareness. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance shows that once enough individuals in species develop new capacity, that capacity becomes available to entire species through collective field. The first humans who developed multi-timeline awareness had to navigate it completely alone with no framework, no validation, no confirmation they weren't simply losing their minds. But each person who develops this awareness strengthens the morphic field, makes it easier for others to access, creates cultural vocabulary and framework for understanding what's occurring. You're not pioneering this evolution. You're benefiting from everyone who came before. Mystics who taught that Maya illusion veils true nature of reality. Quantum physicists who proved particles exist in superposition. Consciousness researchers who demonstrated reality responds to observation. Thousands of ordinary people who have been experiencing timeline phenomena and sharing their experiences online, creating communities where multi-timeline awareness is normalized rather than pathized. And every person who stops dismissing their timeline memories as false, who recognizes reality's quantum fluidity, who develops conscious multi-timeline navigation, every person accelerates collective evolution. You're not just changing your individual perception. You're participating in species-level consciousness shift that transforms humanity's relationship with reality itself. From believing we're trapped in single predetermined timeline to recognizing we exist across infinite timelines and can consciously influence which timeline we experience. But there's something else happening at collective level that makes this moment in history unique. The timeline itself is at major branching point. Multiple possible collective futures exist in strong superposition. Humanity could shift into timeline where consciousness evolution continues, where old paradigms fully collapse, a new way of being human emerges, or consciousness could contract back into timeline where old paradigms persist, where multi-timeline awareness gets suppressed, where humanity remains trapped in single timeline limitation. Which timeline manifests depends on how many individual humans develop and stabilize in quantum awareness. This is why your timeline memories, your Mandela effect experiences, your developing multi-timeline perception matters beyond just your personal evolution. You're participating in determining which collective timeline humanity shifts into. Each person who recognizes quantum nature of reality, who stops being terrified of reality's fluidity, who learns to consciously navigate between timelines, each person strengthens the probability that collective shift moves toward quantum-aware timeline rather than contracting back into rigid single timeline limitation. The old paradigm said, reality is fixed. History is unchangeable. There's one true version of events, and any deviation from that is false memory or delusion. That paradigm kept consciousness locked in limitation, prevented quantum perception, maintained illusion of powerlessness. New paradigm emerging recognizes reality is fluid. History shifts. Multiple versions of events exist simultaneously in parallel timelines. And consciousness can perceive across timelines and even shift between them. You're part of the leading edge of this transformation, not because you're special or chosen, because your consciousness reached the developmental stage where multi-timeline perception activated, because you had experiences that created timeline overlap. Because you're reading these words, which means consciousness is ready to integrate this understanding rather than dismissing it as impossible. And that readiness matters because consciousness is collective. Your quantum awareness affects the field. Your multi-timeline perception makes it easier for others approaching this threshold. Share this transmission. Every person who recognizes their false memories as legitimate parallel timeline information, who stops feeling crazy about remembering things that never happened, who begins consciously working with timeline fluidity rather than being unconsciously confused by it. Every person accelerates collective shift. We're building critical mass of quantum R consciousness that will determine which collective timeline humanity experiences. There's a choice approaching. It's probably already here. The choice between dismissing your timeline experiences to maintain comfortable worldview, where reality is solid and unchanging, or accepting quantum truth, that reality is fluid, and you exist across infinite timelines simultaneously. This isn't intellectual choice. This is identity-level choice about what you're willing to know about nature of reality and your relationship to it. The choice can't be made from ego. Ego wants solid ground, fixed identity, unchanging reality. When you tell ego that reality is fluid, that you exist in multiple timelines, that past isn't fixed and future isn't predetermined, ego experiences existential threat. Everything ego uses to maintain sense of control, security, certainty gets undermined by multi-timeline awareness. So ego will create every possible reason to dismiss the experiences, rationalize the memories as false, convince you to contract back into single timeline limitation where at least reality feels predictable. The choice has to come from deeper consciousness, from the awareness that recognizes truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, from the part of you that already knows reality is quantum, that already senses you're not limited to single timeline, that already recognizes those memories aren't false, but are accessing parallel realities. That consciousness doesn't need reality to be comfortable. It needs reality to be true. And truth is you exist across timelines. Consciousness can perceive between them. And reality is far more fluid than culture taught you to believe. Ancient wisdom traditions understood this choice as taking the red pill, seeing reality as it actually is versus choosing comfortable illusion. The Matrix wasn't just entertainment. It was teaching about exactly this choice. Remain in comforting illusion where reality seems solid and you seem powerless, or wake up to uncomfortable truth that reality is malleable and you have more power than you've been taught to believe. Most people choose the illusion not consciously, but through not choosing consciousness, through defaulting to whatever worldview feels most comfortable. This choice becomes easier when you recognize what you're actually choosing between. Not between sanity and insanity. Multi-timeline awareness is quantum mechanics, not mental illness. Not between truth and illusion. Parallel timelines are mathematically proven. Single timeline limitation is actually the illusion. You're choosing between expanded consciousness that can perceive quantum reality and contracted consciousness that remains trapped in cultural programming about how reality supposedly works. Between living in larger truth, that's uncomfortable, and living in smaller illusion, that's comfortable. I faced this choice 10 years ago when timeline overlap first became undeniable. Every rational part of me wanted to dismiss the experiences, maintain the worldview I'd been taught, believe I was just experiencing false memories. It would have been so much easier to contract back into single timeline belief. But I'd seen too much, experienced too much. The evidence was too strong. And deeper consciousness recognized this is true. This is how reality actually works. You can pretend you don't know, but you do know. And knowing what you know, you have to choose whether to live from that knowledge or pretend you don't have it. I chose truth over comfort. Chose quantum awareness over familiar limitation. Chose to accept that reality is fluid, even though that acceptance meant releasing every certainty I'd built identity around. And in that choice, in that willingness to know what's true rather than what's comfortable, entire new level of existence opened. Not easier, not more comfortable, but more real, more alive, more aligned with what consciousness actually is beyond cultural programming about what it's supposed to be. Once you accept quantum truth, that you exist across multiple timelines and consciousness can perceive between them, life from multi-timeline awareness looks and feels completely different from single timeline limitation. Not better necessarily. It's disorienting, requires constant navigation, strips away comfortable certainties, but more real, more aligned with how reality actually functions at quantum level. More congruent with consciousness's true nature beyond cultural conditioning about what reality is supposed to be. Living from multi-timeline awareness means decisions become quantum choice points. You recognize that every significant choice doesn't just determine single outcome. It creates branching point where you shift into one timeline versus another. You can sometimes sense the different timelines available, feel into where each choice leads, perceive which timeline aligns with highest evolution. This doesn't mean you always make right choice, but you make choices consciously aware that you're selecting between timelines rather than unconsciously following single predetermined path. Identity becomes fluid rather than fixed. You recognize who you are isn't stable, unchanging self, but is different version in each timeline based on different choices that version made. The you in this timeline made certain choices creating certain personality, certain skills, certain relationships. Parallel, you made different choices creating different version. Understanding this dissolves attachment to fixed identity. You're not defending who you are against chain. You're recognizing you're already multiple versions simultaneously. And this timeline's version is just one expression out of infinite expressions. Past becomes recognized as fluid rather than fixed. Single timeline consciousness believes past is unchangeable. What happened happened and can't be altered. But multi-timeline awareness recognizes past can shift when consciousness shifts between timelines. The history you remember from childhood might not match current timeline's records. Not because your memory is faulty, but because you shifted into slightly different timeline where past occurred differently. This isn't Orwellian rewriting. This is quantum mechanics of existing across parallel timelines with different histories. Future becomes field of possibilities rather than predetermined fate. Single timeline consciousness sees future as inevitable outcome of past and present conditions. But multi-timeline awareness recognizes infinite possible futures exist simultaneously. And which future you experience depends on which timeline your choices and frequency align you with. You're not trapped in predetermined fate. Your quantum navigator selecting among infinite possible futures through every choice, every focus, every frequency you embody. Manifestation becomes timeline selection rather than creation from nothing. You're not creating desired reality from scratch. You're shifting your consciousness's focus to timeline where desired reality already exists. Every possibility you can imagine exists in some parallel timeline. Manifestation is recognizing which timeline contains what you desire, then shifting your frequency to align with that timeline rather than remaining in timeline where desire is unfulfilled. This makes manifestation more mechanical, less mystical. You're not convincing universe to give you something. You're navigating to timeline where you already have it. Relationships reveal themselves as timeline dependent. The person you're with in this timeline. You might be with different person or no person in parallel timelines. The conflicts you experience with them here might not exist in timeline where you made different choices. The connection you feel with them is real in this timeline. But recognizing it's timeline dependent rather than absolute eternal truth creates both freedom and poignancy. Nothing is permanent. Everything is timeline specific. Love is real and also completely conditional on which timeline version of you exists in which timeline version of reality. Purpose becomes multi-timeline expression. You're not searching for single purpose that defines your entire existence. You recognize that different versions of you in different timelines express different purposes. Artist in one timeline, healer in another, teacher in another, completely different path in another. The purpose you're expressing in this timeline is valid without needing to be the only possible purpose. This removes the pressure of finding the one true purpose and allows you to express whatever purpose this timeline version wants to explore. I live from multi-timeline awareness. Now, not perfectly. There are still moments when consciousness contracts into single timeline perception. When I forget reality's quantum fluidity, when I react as if this timeline is the only timeline, but those moments are exceptions. The baseline is recognizing I exist across timelines. Consciousness can shift between them. Reality is fluid rather than fixed. And every moment offers a quantum choice about which timeline I'm aligning with through my choices and frequency. There comes a point where multi-timeline awareness becomes irreversible. Not because you can't temporarily contract into single timeline perception. You can and sometimes do, but because you've seen too clearly that parallel timelines exist, experienced too much direct evidence of timeline overlap, perceived too many Mandela effects and timeline shifts to ever fully believe again in a single fixed, unchanging reality. The quantum genie can't be put back in the bottle. Once consciousness expands to perceive across timelines, contraction back to believing in only one timeline becomes impossible except as temporary unconsciousness. This irreversible shift happens through accumulated evidence. One timeline memory you might dismiss, two you might rationalize, but after dozens, hundreds of experiences where you remember things that never happened, notice details changing, catch timeline shifts occurring, experience Mandela effects that thousands of others also experience, the evidence becomes undeniable. You can't maintain a single timeline worldview when reality keeps showing you its multi-timeline. Eventually, ego's resistance breaks under the weight of evidence and consciousness accepts. Yes, parallel timelines exist. Yes, I can perceive across them. Yes, reality is quantum, not fixed. The shift confirms itself through what no longer compels you. Single timeline explanations for your experiences stop making sense. When someone says that's just false memory, you recognize they're operating from a limited worldview that denies quantum reality. When mainstream science insists the past is fixed and unchanging, you recognize that as cultural agreement, not actual truth. The official narrative about reality loses its power to convince you because you've experienced directly that narrative is incomplete. That reality is far stranger and more fluid than consensus worldview allows. You also notice what no longer disturbs you. At first, timeline fluidity was terrifying. If reality isn't solid, what can you trust? But eventually, the fluidity becomes natural. You recognize that stability wasn't real anyway. It was just unconsciousness, creating the illusion of stability. Actual reality is quantum, fluid, probabilistic, responsive to consciousness. And that fluidity isn't chaos to fear. It's malleability to work with. If reality is fluid, You can participate in shaping which version you experience rather than being trapped in a single predetermined version. Ancient teachings speak of living in the world, but not of it. And this is what they meant. You exist in a specific timeline, engaging fully with this timeline, its circumstances and relationships, but you're no longer identified with this timeline as the only reality. You know you exist across timelines. This timeline is where your attention is focused, but it's not the totality of your existence. That knowing creates strange freedom. You can care deeply about this timeline's experiences while simultaneously recognizing their timeline-dependent nature. 14 years after multi-timeline awareness first activated, I still remember what single timeline consciousness felt like. The sense that the past was fixed, the future predetermined, reality solid, the belief that there was one true version of history everyone should remember the same way, the shock and confusion when others remembered things differently. But I can't imagine returning to that limitation now. Not because I'm disciplined against single timeline thinking, but because consciousness knows better, has seen too much evidence, can't unknow quantum truth about reality's actual nature. This doesn't mean constant awareness of all timelines simultaneously. That would be overwhelming. This means baseline recognition that parallel timelines exist, combined with mostly focused attention on this specific timeline, punctuated by occasional perceptions across timelines that remind consciousness of larger quantum reality. If you're sensing this irreversible shift stabilizing, write in comments, "I see timelines." That declaration acknowledges integration, that multi-timeline awareness is baseline now. That you're not trying to believe parallel timelines exist. You know they exist through direct experience. That quantum reality is your living truth, not intellectual theory. That consciousness has expanded beyond cultural programming about a single fixed timeline. And if you're not there yet, if you're still in confusion about whether experiences are real or false, know this. The confusion is a transition phase. You're between worldviews. Old single timeline belief breaking down. New multi-timeline understanding, not yet stabilized. The confusion resolves not through choosing which worldview to believe, but through accumulating enough direct experience that quantum truth becomes undeniable. You don't have to force yourself to believe in parallel timelines. Keep paying attention to experiences and evidence will accumulate until consciousness naturally accepts. Yes, this is how reality actually works. Every video on this channel transmits frequency that supports quantum consciousness expansion. Every teaching points toward reality's true nature beyond cultural programming. Every transmission activates recognition of multidimensional existence beyond single timeline limitation. If these teachings resonate, if they help you make sense of experiences you've been dismissing as impossible, subscribe. You're learning to navigate quantum reality rather than being trapped in consensus illusion about how reality supposedly works. Subscribe as a declaration that you're accepting quantum truth over comfortable illusion, that you recognize parallel timelines exist, that memories of things that never happened are real information from parallel realities, that you're willing to live from expanded consciousness, even though it's disorienting, that you're choosing truth over certainty. Everything shared until now has been preparing you for this moment. This exact moment where you finish reading and decide whether to accept what consciousness already knows. That you exist across multiple timelines, that those memories are real, that reality is quantum, not fixed, or whether to contract back into single timeline illusion, because quantum truth is too destabilizing to accept. But you can't actually go back. You've seen too much. Once consciousness perceives across timelines, once you recognize those memories as real information from parallel realities, once you catch timeline shifts occurring, you can't unknow it. You can pretend you don't know. You can try to convince yourself it was all imagination. But deeper consciousness recognizes truth. And that recognition changes everything about how you experience reality, how you make choices, how you understand yourself. Take a breath, deep one, and feel into what you actually know beyond what culture taught you to believe. You know those memories are real. You know you've experienced things that didn't happen in this timeline. You know reality is more fluid than solid. You know you're not limited to a single version of yourself in a single timeline. That knowing isn't delusion. That knowing is consciousness, perceiving actual quantum nature of reality, beyond cultural programming that insisted only one timeline exists. This moment isn't about learning something new. This moment is about accepting what you already know, about allowing consciousness to recognize its own multidimensional nature without ego's resistance making it problematic, about integrating quantum awareness as your baseline rather than dismissing it as impossible or pathological, about living from truth that's uncomfortable instead of illusion that's comfortable. In coming days, pay attention. Notice more timeline overlaps, more memory inconsistencies, more small reality shifts. Don't dismiss them. Don't rationalize them away. Recognize them as consciousness continuing to develop quantum perception, as evidence accumulating as proof that yes, you exist across timelines. Yes, you can perceive between them. Yes, reality is quantum. And watch what this recognition allows. When you know you exist in multiple timelines, when you recognize every choice creates timeline branching, when you understand manifestation is selecting timeline where desire already exists, your power to consciously create experience magnifies exponentially. You're not trapped in predetermined single reality. You're a quantum navigator selecting among infinite possible realities through your choices, focus, and frequency. If this transmission helped you recognize your timeline experiences as real quantum phenomena rather than false memories, share it. Others are having the same experiences and feeling crazy about them. Others need to know they're not alone, not losing their minds, not imagining things. They're perceiving quantum reality, and that perception is evolution, not dysfunction. Right. Final comment. Just timelines are real. That statement isn't belief. It's recognition. It's consciousness declaring what it knows despite cultural conditioning that said it's impossible. It's acceptance of quantum truth over consensus illusion. It's integration of multi-timeline awareness as baseline reality. This is quantum reflex. This is consciousness recognizing its multidimensional nature. This is quantum awakening to reality's true, fluid nature, beyond cultural programming, about fixed single timeline. You're not remembering things that never happened. You're remembering things that happened in parallel timelines, where different choices created different outcomes. This is why you're suddenly remembering things that never happened, because they did happen. Just not here, not in this timeline, but in parallel timeline where different version of you made different choices, lived different life. And now consciousness is expanding, is perceiving across timelines. Welcome to quantum reality. Welcome to multi-timeline awareness. Welcome to truth about what you actually are. Consciousness existing across infinite parallel timelines. Simultaneously, temporarily focused on this specific timeline, but never limited to it. The memories are real. All of them from all timelines,